Now that we've completed demand, let's move on to the other side of the supply-demand graph, supply. Now, before we get started, I do want to make sure everyone's kind of on the same page here that supply, though not necessarily a difficult topic, it is going to be a little bit different than demand, going to be a little bit more difficult to grasp. Not difficult, but just more difficult as compared to demand, because like we said early on in demand, everyone thinks on the demand side of the graph. We've all been in demand of something, whether you're Elon Musk or you're just scraping by financially. We all have to buy something. Like, we can't possibly produce everything on our own, all by ourselves. We all will demand something no matter where we fall in society. The difference between that and supply is that not all of us fall on the supply side of the graph. You may come from a family that runs their own business, so this may come fairly easy for you because you've kind of grown up with the producer mindset. So as we go through these slides and as we're going through the different concepts, just keep in mind you have to think differently than you do as a consumer. You have to think like a producer or someone who is going to be supplying various goods and services to the market. So just kind of keep that in mind as we go through. So the topics that we're going to be looking at today are supply curve, market supply, change in supply, and then non-determinants or non-price determinants of supply in various different aspects there. There's going to be a lot of crossover. That's why this is going to be a little bit shorter of a lesson. It's just everything's going to be kind of flipped. So let's dive in. So let's just jump into the graph and the various components. Before we start that though, let's define what we mean by the law of supply. How does supply work? It works opposite of demand. Whereas the law of demand stated as the price increases, demand decreases, and as price decreased, demand increased. Sorry, I got mixed up there. The law of supply is going to work the opposite. As the price increases, supply is going to increase, and as price decreases, supply is also going to decrease. Remember, think like a producer. The goal of every business, every producer, every supplier in the market is to do what? Is to make money, is to turn a profit. These are business owners, right? So if the price of a particular good goes up, you're going to want to sell more because you can turn a higher or a larger profit. If the price begins to drop, you're going to supply less because you're not going to make as much. And over time, you actually may move on to something else that makes more, and supply of a particular good or service vanishes. The supplier of lighting oil back in the day when people used to actually burn candles at night. Once the light bulb hit, those suppliers went away. They may have changed to start selling light bulbs because they're in the lighting business. But the supply of lighting oil began to go down, if not all, and eventually vanish altogether. So law of supply is the opposite of the law of demand. When prices rise, supply also rises. When prices fall, supply falls. We call this a positive relationship, meaning that when one side does one thing, the other does the same thing. And we can see that when we look at a supply schedule. As we look at the supply schedule, at a price of 400 of whatever good or service this is, we're going to sell a quantity of 2,000 units. As the price begins to drop at 325, so a loss of $75 of value, we're now going to be wanting to sell 1,750. And we can see this trend continue down. Now, again, law of supply, as prices are high, quantity supplied is high. So 400, we have 2,000. And then as price begins to drop all the way down to $100 per unit, we're going to sell about 1,000. So we see the law of supply playing out here in this chart. Now, just like before with demand, we can take this supply schedule and we can begin to create our supply curve. Whereas at and again, every single level, let me erase that for us. at every single level here. We just simply use these as plotting points to eventually draw our supply. So at $400, we have a quantity of 2, and so there is our dot. And then we just do each single level the exact same way, all the way down until then we can draw our supply curve. And it would look like. Now, supply, if you look, has that positive relationship. So it's going in a upward slope, just like we see here. Demand, on the other hand, remember, it has that inverse relationship. So it has a downward sloping look. So it was a kind of a rough looking D there, but that is a D. So demand will always be a downward sloping line, and supply will always be a upward sloping line. So don't forget that. So this law of demand creates this positive relationship, creates this upward sloping curve. So let's look at the market supply. Like I said, a lot of these things are going to be the same. We're just looking at it kind of from the flipped perspective. So the market supply is going to be exactly the same as market demand. We simply look at the supply schedule for individual producers. So we have Glass Corp supply schedule, and this is the doesn't really say what it's for. So we'll just go with it. But at a price of 15, whatever they're selling, they're going to sell, or they're going to try to supply 5. At a price of $10, so it goes down, they're going to supply 3. 5 is 1, and then we have the Tower Incorporated Supply Company. And you have a price of 15, quantity supplied is going to be 4, and again, the law of supply, as prices drop, so does supply. So at $10, we have 3, and we see that trend. And so then we just simply take those two, and we're going to add them. Let me turn this off. We're going to add them together. We take each price point, and we simply add up at those price points the supply that each corporation is going to supply. So 5 plus 4 is 9, 3 plus 3 is 6, and 1 plus 2 is 3. And this gives us, right here, this gives us our market supply schedule. And then we can use that schedule to then create our new market supply curve. So each one of these represents the individual's firm supply curve, and then this long red one here represents the new market supply. So again, just like the market or market demand, we could do the same thing for market supply. Everything will just trend in the opposite direction. Okay, so let's get into change in supply. Okay, just like with demand, when we have a price that goes from $5 to $3, what does that mean? That means we have a movement on the supply curve. Then nothing is shifting yet because it is a change in the price. So it's going to change the quantity supplied. So if it's a change in supply, it's going to be a shift. If it's a change in quantity supplied, it's going to be a movement. And just like we see here, we go from $3 to $5. Okay, so if we're going to be analyzing this, okay, at $3, how much are we going to be supplying? We're going to be supplying 300. What happens if price increases to $5? Well, we just look at the movement, we go to that point, and then we say, okay, our answer would be we're going to supply 500. That's simple. Okay. Now, what happens when we have a change in supply? Again, this is going to be a mirror image almost of demand. An increase in supply will be a shift to the right. So we have our supply 1 curve. Whatever takes place, we're going to go over all the different things that could take place here in a second. But whatever that is, it caused an increase, and so it's going to be a shift to the right. So if you're taking notes like you were last time, an increase is always a shift to the right. An increase will always be a shift to the right. Okay, and also like demand, a decrease will always be a shift to the left. So when we start going through things that can cause a decrease in supply, if it's a non-price determinant, anything outside the price of the good itself, and that of the good itself is important. So make sure we're following along with that. If it's anything that causes a decrease outside of the price itself, it's going to move in a leftward shift, just like demand. An increase is always going to be, and I keep repeating this, I know, probably, man, you said this 12 times, is because this is, historically with my students, this is the hardest thing to grasp. Why, I don't know, but it is, and that's fine because we're learning. But a supply or demand, an increase is always a shift to the right, and in supply and demand, a decrease is always a shift to the left. So to reiterate, let's kind of see both these play out at the same time. This is what an increase, this right here is what an increase in quantity supply looks like. It's changing because of the price change. And that's the only thing that's going to cause a movement. And a movement would just look something like this. Increase in the supply by itself is a non-price determinant. And so you're going to have a supply change at every single price point along your graph, which would cause this rightward moving shift because we are increasing supply. Okay, vice versa. A decrease in the quantity supplied because of the price change, price drops, have a movement down your demand curve. If it's a decrease of something outside of the price, right, you're going to have a leftward shift. It's going to look like that. Okay, determinants of supply. First, we're going to talk about taxes and subsidies. Okay, so taxes. It's simply a payment made to the government as a result of an economic activity. We all know what taxes are, right? So, from the business perspective, if you're paying taxes on a good, it means it's costing you more to produce that good because you got to give a little bit to Uncle Sam. Now, if it's going to cost you more, that means that you're going to be able to produce less. So, generally, and 99.9% of the time, taxes are always going to cause a shift to the left. It's going to cause a decrease in supply because some of the money that you have to produce the goods are going to have to go to pay your taxes. That's money that you can't use to produce goods. Thus, you're not going to be able to produce as much to put on or to supply the market with. So you have a decrease in supply. If we're talking about money and prices here, yes, but we're not talking about the price of the good itself. We're talking about adding a tax to it. So it's a non-price determinant outside of the price of the good itself. That's why I say that of the good itself is a very important aspect. You can have price changes in the back end because of taxes, and we're going to talk subsidies here in a second, but that's not of the good itself. You have the price of the good itself, and then you have something outside that price affecting that market, and in this case affecting that price to drop, to basically siphon a little bit of money from the producer so they can't produce as much. So you have a decrease in supply, which again would be that shift to the left. Subsidies are essentially payments made by the government to the producer to produce something, or at least to help offset some of the low prices so they're willing to produce more. So subsidies have the opposite effect, where a tax will take money from the business. Subsidies add money to the business, so now it's more advantageous, right? They can make more of a profit to produce more. Corn, various produce, the agricultural industry is subsidized quite a bit by the government, especially here in the United States. And so they're actually paid extra to produce an extra unit of corn or tomatoes or whatever. Pick your produce. For everyone they produce, they know they're going to get money for the government, and then they can take that produce and sell it and make even more money. So again, it raises the value of their product, and it creates a more of an incentive for the producer to produce more because they can make more money. So a subsidy is generally a shift to the right because it is creating more of an incentive, thus it is helping to add more produce to the market, whether it be for food supply or to maintain prices. Okay, some other non-determinants of supply: resource cost and technology. Okay, so the definition of a resource is an input used to produce a good or service, also known as a factors of production. We'll go into factors of production later in this class. But anything used to produce the good or service is considered a resource. So if you're baking, so let's say you're making muffins, you're a baker. You have the flour, the sugar, the yeast, whatever you use to make those muffins, the frosting on top, whatever so the milk, the eggs, whatever that, all that stuff, those are all resources that are going to be used to produce your good or service. So what happens if prices begin to change on the goods, or sorry, on the resources to produce the good? You can sell your product. So in this example, if you can sell your product for $5 and a resource, say, let's say electricity, becomes cheaper, do you think you will be able to produce more or less of the product? So to reiterate, whatever you're producing, part of what to produce, you take electricity. All of a sudden, the electricity becomes cheaper. You have more money now to put into other resources to produce the product. So a decrease in one of the resources typically leads to an increase in supply, because now you can use one resource, money, now to produce more of your good. Okay, so in the same spirit there, if one of your resources, in this case electricity again, becomes more expensive, now you have to use more money to produce your product, and you're spending more on one resource. So this is going to cause a shift to the left. It's going to cause a decrease in supply. So again, the book uses money. Here, let's look at this first. So again, we can kind of see both these playing out. Like the book uses electricity. I like using something a little more tangible. So again, let's go back to muffins. So you're a baker, and you're making muffins. That's your product. So the price of flour increases. Now, can you produce as many muffins now because you're paying more for flour? Of course not. That's going to cause that decrease in supply here. Okay, but all of a sudden you go to buy supplies and the price of flour dropped by 50%. So you can buy the same amount of flour for half the price, and now you can use all that other money to maybe buy 15% more of every resource to produce more, and now you are producing more muffins. So you have a increase in supply. Again, not because of the good itself, not for the price that you're selling the muffin for, right? But prices outside of the good itself. In this case, input prices, or as this book says, resource prices. Okay, technology. Technology is another aspect that can cause a shift in supply. Typically, technology will always be a shift to the right. Now, there is a scenario where it can cause a decrease, but typically that's when you stop using a technology. But 99% of the time, technological advances will always be a shift to the right. What I like to use in my classes, in my in-person classes, as an example of that, is Henry Ford and the assembly line making cars. Before Henry Ford went to Europe and and discovered, quote unquote, but observed the assembly line being used with smaller goods and services, like mostly goods, he was producing cars with a group of mechanics. They had a space about the size of a couple of regular sized classrooms, as a reference for you, and they all worked on the car, and each step all kind of helping each other out, or all doing the same, all doing each part of the job. Well, the idea is that, as the story goes, he comes back and he shuts his factory down and begins to produce cars, or begins to set up the assembly line, and he brings all his employees back in, and they each do one individual job along the assembly line. And again, don't quote me on the actual numbers, but the percentages will hold. For this example, we'll just say let's say he goes from making 10 cars a day to 200 cars a day, right? It was a huge increase in the supply of the Model T, or whatever he was producing at the time. And so that's an example of a technological advance. Typically, that's going to make it easier, make it cheaper, make it more efficient, is the idea in producing whatever that is. So in the case of Henry Ford, it became more efficient in producing automobiles. Each worker could simply focus on becoming the best they could be at whatever position they found themselves at on the assembly line, whether it was to do the lug nuts, put the steering wheel on, insert the engine, or however or wherever they fell on the assembly line. They became experts at that one thing, and they could do it faster and faster, and they began to produce more and more cars with the same amount of resources. That's the key. So, just to reiterate, a technological increase is going to increase supply, and it's going to, again, nothing to do with the price itself. So it's going to be a shift to the right. Okay, some more non-price determinants of supply is price expectations and number of sellers. So these are going to, again, sort of mirror demand, but we're just going to look at them a little bit. Okay, so with the original market, when we're talking about number of sellers, the original market, we have two firms and a price at $10. One firm's going to produce 10 units or whatever this is, and then firm 2 is going to produce 7, and we can see that we're simply adding those up, right? We're creating our market total. So when we add the number of sellers, what's going to happen to the supply of the good? It's real straightforward. So as we add a new firm, they have their whole new list, or their whole new supply schedule, and we just simply add up all those together, and that equals 21. We add up all these together, and that's going to equal 18, and we create a new market supply. So what happened between the original market and now this new market with one new firm? Obviously, we have more units being supplied, so an increase in the number of sellers is going to be a shift to the right because we are increasing supply. Straightforward, okay? And let's say we had the same situation, but we started with 3 firms and we dropped it down to 2. Logically, what's going to happen? We have 3 firms producing a good. All of a sudden, we just have 2 because one goes out of business or whatever happened to it. It's going to cause a decrease in supply because we have a decrease in the number of sellers. This was part of the issue with the Great Depression. As the market spun out of control, business began to go out of business, and so you had less and less business producing goods. So it basically made goods more scarce, and the prices began to rise. That was one factor in hundreds of factors in the Great Depression. But it's essentially what we're talking about here. A decrease in the number of sellers, a decrease in the number of sellers creates a leftward shift, because again, a leftward shift is a decrease in supply. And we can see that playing out here. An increase is always going to be a shift to the right. Repetition. That's most of education. So an increase will always be a shift to the right, and a decrease will always be a shift to the left. And this does not matter, again, if you're talking about supply or demand. Okay, let's talk about sellers' expectations. The anticipation of future outcomes. And that includes price, or to be able to find the resources or the inputs to create goods. People are going to respond to expectation about the future. Okay, expectations can affect the market. If it's expected that the price of a certain good is going to go, or an input good is going to go up, producers can then start to stockpile that with the cheaper prices, and then it begins to affect the market. Another example is oil companies. An oil company will produce a certain amount of oil, and if it's expected in the future that the price of oil is going to begin to go down, they're going to want to shove as much oil in the market while the price is still high as they can, and so supply is going to go up. Vice versa, if the oil company has their stockpile of oil and it's thought that the prices are going to go down, if they're going to go up, they're going to hold back on the lower prices, and so there's going to be less on the market, and then when the prices rise, then they're going to flood the market. So depending on the expectation, it can either decrease or it can increase supply. So to recap, we have our 6 non-price determinants of supply. We have taxes. It's going to usually cause a leftward shift because it's adding to the price, or it's taking away from the profit the business is going to make. So they can essentially get less. There's less incentive to supply. A subsidy is going to have the opposite effect. It's going to increase supply because the more units they can produce, it's guaranteed income. Plus, they can also sell it in the market, and they can kind of double dip in making a profit off their good. Okay, resource costs can go either way depending on what happens to those inputs, those resources to produce the good. Use of technology, again, is going to typically be a shift to the right, and we're talking about technological advances here. So it's going to be a shift to the right because it makes the firm or the producer simply more efficient in producing the good or service. Numbers of sellers can go either way. If you have a decrease in the number of sellers, you're going to have a leftward shift because you're decreasing the amount of suppliers, so you're decreasing the supply of the good. If you have a new business join a market, you're increasing the sellers. It's going to increase the supply because there's simply more people producing good. And the expectation of future prices can have the same either way effect. If the business thinks they can get more in the future, they're going to lower their supply and wait for those higher prices. If they think they can get less in the future, they're going to flood the market and increase supply to take advantage of the high prices.